Welcome, welcome everyone. I'm Lisa Fain. I am delighted to be facilitating today's MELD conversation on creating organizational support for mentoring, policies and structures that make mentoring programs thrive. I'm stepping in for our colleague Tamara Thorpe today, who is unfortunately under the weather. We're sending her our best, but I am grateful to be with you for what I think is a timely and important conversation, which is really at the heart of what makes mentoring work. We know that many organizations care deeply about mentoring. They launch programs with energy, with good intentions and committed people, but mentoring cannot be sustained by enthusiasm alone, as we all know. So it needs structure, it needs clarity, and it needs policies and practices that make good mentoring easier to do, easier to access, and easier to sustain. So today we're going to explore a central question, which is what organizational conditions help mentoring relationships and mentoring programs thrive? First, I want to introduce our guests. So we have today the current IMA president, Ben Kutsyuruba, who is a professor in educational policy leadership and school law at the Faculty of Education at Queen's University in Ontario. Throughout his career, Ben has worked as a teacher, researcher, manager, and professor in the field of education in Ukraine and Canada. He currently serves, as I said, as president of IMA from 2026 through 2028, and is currently focusing his research on positive leadership, flourishing in schools, educator well-being, and teacher induction and mentoring in international settings. Welcome, Ben. Also welcome to Dr. Laura Lunsford, who is a leading scholar and practitioner in the field of research mentoring. She is a senior leadership consultant at Novant Health and was previously at the National Science Foundation. She's served as a tenured professor at Campbell University and the University of Arizona. A psychologist and Fulbright scholar, Laura is the co-founder of Lead Mentor Develop LLC and the author of The Mentor's Guide, 5 Steps to Build a Successful Mentoring Program. She's an IMA certified consultant who's published extensively on leadership, mentoring, and program evaluation, and has worked with universities, corporations, and government agencies to build impactful mentoring cultures. Her work bridges research and practice with an emphasis on inclusion, evidence-based approaches to developing the next generation of scholars. Welcome, Laura. Glad you're here. And finally, Jean Rhodes, who is the Frank L. Boyden Professor of Psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Director of the Center for Evidence-Based Mentoring. Her research examines how organizational practices and policies influence the quality and impact of mentoring relationships. She's also the co-founder of Mentor Pro, which is an evidence-based mentoring platform that translates decades of mentoring research into practical tools that help organizations structure, monitor, and scale high-quality mentoring programs. Welcome, Jean, and happy birthday to you. Jean is joining us on her birthday. So happy birthday to Jean, and welcome to all of our panelists. So I want to just start then with the big picture, because mentoring is often talked about as a relationship, but today we're looking at the organizational scaffolding that makes those relationships more likely to succeed. So for all of our panelists, my first question to you is, when you think about mentoring programs that thrive, what are the organizational conditions, policies, or structures that seem to matter most? Laura, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Interestingly, I'm working with 2 programs in very different organizations, one at a large healthcare organization and one with a pre-college mentoring program at a university. And in all these situations, high-level visibility, endorsement from the top, a lot of people put that in the chat, is critical number 1, because if you don't have that, it's going to be very difficult to sustain the program and to have access to the kind of resources. The second one is that, especially in organizations, that people have time to meet. In healthcare, for example, some aspects of that are really challenging. So supervisors need to provide protected time for certain areas to be able to be paid that they can do it as part of being on the job. And finally, in terms of structures, I think having some sort of program manager or director is really critical, and having it officially embedded in a relevant office, whether that's HR in an organization or in a provost office, if it's a faculty mentoring program, are really key.
Thanks so much, Laura. You know, that idea of protected time is so important. It's not just saying that it's important, it's really carving that out, and making sure that there's really no uh, ramifications, no negative ramifications for that as well. Ben, how about you? Your thoughts about when you think about mentoring programs that thrive, what are the organizational conditions, policies, or structures that seem to matter most?
Thanks, Lisa. I think I'll phrase or frame a lot of my responses within our research on teacher induction and mentoring. And what we found is that the beginning teachers need mentoring that is structural and not merely interpersonal. It has to be built into staffing, similar to what Laura shared, leadership, time allocation, and growing a strong school culture. And if those things will not allow it not only survive but thrive as well. But also we've seen that the policy has a key role in making sure that the mentoring is systematic. And that is key. Policy as a guideline has a key role in that. We see in our research that when mentoring is effective, it's when policies fund the time, allow for the structured approach, support leadership, provide leadership scaffolding, and are also context specific. They're aligned with the cultural political and structural organizational settings, then it allows mentoring to not only connect people, but also solve the attrition and well-being challenges as we see in K-12 system.
Hmm. Thanks so much for that. Jean, your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, there's not much to add given the wonderful comments of Ben and Laura, but I will say I'm coming from the more of the youth mentoring, although college as well. And for what I've seen in the data, because I've published hundreds of papers on this, is that you have to have structured preparation for the mentors. It's not enough to have good intentions. You have to have good training. And then not just training that is just in case I'm going to tell you all this, it's just in time. So if something comes up in that relationship, that the training is available or the resources are available to help them with that one particular issue, because you can't anticipate everything. There has to be goals, clear goal setting, and that needs to be conveyed to mentors. Too often, and particularly in the field of K-12 mentoring, there's just this notion that a friendship is enough, that you can just put people together and kismet will happen and things will change, but you have to have goals. And another thing is monitoring, relationships ebb and flow, and knowing, kind of being able to anticipate early problems and intervene to keep that relationship going is vital. And then, we've talked about this, but the staff capacity to, be able to support those relationships is really important.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's stick with you for a second, Jean. I know you do a lot of writing and researching, and I want to just talk about the evidence a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about what the evidence tells us about which organizational policies or practices most reliably improve mentoring relationship quality and program outcome?
Of course. So again, training, we have a meta-analysis that we did, and meta-analysis is looking at sort of that magnitude of impact across sometimes hundreds of studies. In our case, it was 77 studies. And what really mattered was mentor training and support and supervision. You can't just assume that good intentions are enough. And I can't make that clear enough. The effect size went from 0.04, which is essentially 0, to 0.41 if you controlled for training and support and supervision. So that's key. And then, other things that really help are, what is that training? And the most effective programs, when I looked at, across all of these programs, it included adult programs, college, with specification. So the programs that were getting the largest effects were the ones where it was like, STEM for young women, or working with people on the spectrum. So having kind of less of a kind of non-specific approach to being, all right, this is the group I'm working with. I'm going to be very clear and goal-driven and specific. And when you're targeted and goal-driven, the effect size is double or even sometimes triple, depending on the outcomes you're looking at. So those are my two ones. If I could pick two things, I would like there to be better training and support and greater specificity of what the mentor is doing to what the outcomes and goals of the mentee are.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that a little off our script, but I think it's a
Of
nice
course.
bridge between what your thoughts are and Laura's expertise as well, which is when you talk about supervision of mentoring, that's not often something those of us who work in industry,
Yeah.
think about, right? And I'm wondering if you can talk to how organizations and companies might think about mentoring supervision. Is it a matter of training? Or what should that ongoing support be? So Jean, I'll throw that back to you, and then Laura would love your thoughts on that as well, please.
Well, one of the problems with supervision is that programs haven't really been able to know what's going on. What are you talking about? How often are
Mhm.
you meeting? There's not a lot of tracking that goes on in mentoring programs. And so what I've tried to do is develop systems where you can actually see with more granularity what each relationship is up to, and then be able to do course corrections as needed. So it's really having kind of more transparency, enable supervision, but it's really just having somebody who you can talk to on a regular basis. And it's not just a perfunctory, how's it going, but really get into it a little bit about how things are progressing in that relationship so that it has the meaningful impact. And, we talk about that as an investment, but think of all the investment of time and resources we put into developing these mentoring programs. If we're not supporting the relationships and the mentors adequately, it's not a good investment. So I think it's worth investing in the supervision infrastructure, including collecting more data so you can track the quality of relationships over time.
Thanks, Jean. Laura, your thoughts?
Well, I think Jean raises such a great point about supervision, and I've worked with a lot of mentors who have many degrees, let's say, and would rebel at the idea of supervision. And yet they need the support. And so, ways that I've seen work effectively are to have check in times for all the mentors to come together, sort of create a learning community, what's working well, where are struggles. And in a way, especially for program managers there, this provides an element of supervision without it feeling so hierarchical. So I think really taking that learning approach, educational approach, because then you can kind of meet people if there are certain struggles. Oh, here's some information. Here's ways to ask that. Here's some things you might want to try. Is really critical. And I agree 100% about the data. I mean, one of the programs I'm working with right now in healthcare, they're like, well, we'll just put people together and it's going to be great, and they'll talk and good things will happen. And we just know from the research that's not what happens. And so really putting in some accountability measures to help people understand. And I think this is so critical in organizations. You're not evaluating the person, you're evaluating the process, so that it gives the program then information on additional preparation they need to do, or supports or guidance. And I think that clarification is really critical for success in those situations.
Yeah, that's great. Let me ask you too, Laura, when organizations are building or improving mentoring programs, what policy elements do you think they should have in place at the get-go to help ensure success?
Well, I kind of have two views on this. So, one is organizations have policies to protect organizations. And we need to remember that if we're especially working even in non-for-profit and for-profit. And people who want to do mentoring have the mentees and mentors' interest at heart. But at the end of the day, HR policies and other policies are meant to protect the organization. And so it's really important to also think about how does that then line up with policies. One of our big HR policies is people first. And so how do we line up those organizational policies to protect people, the organization, with also our policies that are going to invest in people? And again, that time. So really clarifying, especially for some professions like nursing, for example, teaching would be another one. But when people are kind of on the clock, how are we expecting them to have the time to engage in mentoring? People often don't think about all the sexual harassment kind of policies. So those are really key to educate mentors and mentees about. Not all these aren't protected conversations like you might have with a counselor or a lawyer. And people have really gotten in trouble over that. There's an interesting article, if you Google Stanford's alumni mentoring program, that were some real problems that are very educational in that effort. So kind of really being clear about those policies and then making sure that the participants know about them are also really key.
Yeah, that communication piece is so key. We have a great question that's germane to this particular topic in the chat that I want to ask you about, Laura, while we've got you on spotlight here. Dr. Martin says, we have in higher education already have a full-time job assignment, but our leadership wants a mentor program. How much full-time equivalency is needed? Can you be effective if you cut into already prescribed staff loads?
Well, I've worked with a lot of faculty mentoring programs, and it really depends on the load. And so for some, the first thing I usually do is pull up the job description. So for department chairs, for example, or deans, mentoring is part of the job. And if we're asking those folks to be engaged, then we need to help align that with that expectation. But if we're talking about, certain faculty or staff or instructional staff members, that might not be seen as part of their job. And so really kind of creating then what that expectation is this additional work and you'll get a stipend for. My feeling is if it's not, for senior faculty, if they're tenured full, it's also part of their job to help develop other faculty. But, to put that on an assistant professor, probably not the best idea in terms of being mentoring. So I think it does depend on who it is. And often it is implied in their position. And if it isn't, maybe those job descriptions need to be rewritten because it often feels like an add-on to faculty. In terms of the time, that's really going to depend on the situation. But I certainly think, people meeting in a formal way, because in universities, it's often sort of this semi-formal piece. If there's a formal program, that kind of needs to be spelled out and have a clear purpose. It's to keep our new faculty getting on to tenure or help to re-energize our mid-career faculty, or whatever that purpose is, matters a lot in terms of the length of it. And then let it be over. And if you want to transition into more informal mentoring, then that's a different situation.
Yeah, I know also, I'm just looking at some of the faces of the folks in the room that there's folks who are joining us who probably have a point of view on that question as well. And it's in addition to our very knowledgeable panelists, we always benefit from the wisdom of folks in the room. So for anyone who has perspective on that question, you can feel free to add yours in the chat as well, and we'll be taking a look at that. But the point that you make, Laura, is a good one, is that it's not just the managing of the program and the monitoring of the program, but also the dedication of time for the mentor and the mentee as well. And those expectations need to be clearly set out. As well. So thanks for that. Ben, given your research on teacher induction and mentoring programs, how do you see that policies can better support the mentoring of early career teachers?
What we've seen is that when mentoring is built into the policy mandates, if it's clearly outlined and is formally guaranteed in the program, those programs are most effective. We've seen it across the provinces. So Canadian setting is a bit different from the US. We have education as provincial responsibility, and so a lot of teacher induction mentoring programs, there's a lot of variance across provinces. So when we did our pan-Canadian analysis, we found that those provinces and territories that provided specific mandates for mentoring to be a part of the induction program, and it was actually formal and guaranteed. Those were the most effective and thriving programs. Another piece was that the programs that the mentoring programs that provided protected time for mentors and mentees to meet, and for leaders to allow a connection with the mentors and mentees. Those were most effective in terms of lower teaching loads, having observation time, coaching built in, and collaborative planning as part of the overall support system. One aspect that we noticed across all the programs was that the effectiveness depended on the training and supports from the school leaders. And if the program did not have a very engaging teacher, school administrator or principal or vice principal, and engaged in the organization and selection of an assignment of mentors, those programs were less effective. Something that we've seen, because again of the geographical representation, is the successful mentoring program aligned policies with local context. So, for example, in the northern parts of Canada, a one-on-one or in-person meetings were less doable because of the very distances and being far away from each other. So adapting the supports, providing for online connections and different staffing realities allowed for more successful programs. Recently, we've focused a lot of our work on well-being for mentoring for well-being, and we see also that mentoring that addresses both instructional growth as well as psychosocial and emotional support allows mentees grow their resilience, allows for growth of trust and overall well-being. And the last point that I'd like to highlight is that when we reduce, or when the policies are aligned towards reducing fragmentation across governance levels, then those gaps are lessened. And so often in policy research, we see the gaps between the policy intent and the actual in-school implementation. And, if there's less fragmentation at that governance level, then, ministries are more connected to districts are more connected to the actual schools, and then the leadership of the school is more connected to the actual programs, mentoring that happens at the school level. So those are just a few highlights from some of our research that could be helpful for others who are working in this area.
That's great, Ben. Thanks so much. Hussein asks, or says, I lead a graduate mentoring program at Queen's University under your supervision, Ben, where mentoring is intentionally open-ended and mentees bring forward issues for discussion. While this flexibility is valuable, we are also interested in identifying and assessing visible outcomes. What strategies or approaches would you recommend for evaluating outcomes in such a flexible mentoring model? And this is really for any of our panelists who'd like to take this question.
Well, I've had to answer in the chat. I don't know that I see too much that's unique often. Maybe it is in this program, but I would probably seek to see if I could categorize those open-ended things that rise up. And they probably can fall into some categories that I could begin to anticipate. For example, for graduate students, it might be around retention or networking, or I don't know if they're older students, sometimes it's around returning to school. So I'd probably try to categorize that and line it up with some common categories we know about, either attitudes, behavior change, career behaviors on mentoring, and look to do some assessment around those categories.
Right.
And if I may jump in, when we started this program, and I'm glad that Hussein brought that question, we had a lot of structural, it was very rigid. And I think over 10 years now, we've seen the pendulum swung more to the more flexibility. But I think finding that middle ground between having some structure and some flexibility for students will probably be the best spot, that sweet spot, the bliss point that allows students to have some flexibility and structured approach. And too much structure allows for does not allow for flexibility, and allows for becomes very rigid and structured.
Jean, anything you would add to that?
I completely agree with Ben, and we've done a number of studies where one is called Finding the Sweet Spot, the other is called Striking the Balance, but the idea is that relationship building should never be overlooked in all of this, that if there's not a connection, no one's going to return. And so we have to think about, leveraging. So, in the very beginning, you really focus on getting to know that person and being available emotionally. And, there's a great podcast I was listening to this morning, and they were talking about, we talk about TMI, too much information, but they said, you know, a big problem in helping relationships is not enough information. You know, we become so worried that we're not being professional, that we're crossing a boundary, that we don't share enough of ourselves. And so, you know, to be reciprocal in sharing, to be a human, not to try to be perfect, to really listen and listen with curiosity, to be empathic and authentic, all of those things build the relationship that then you can leverage for career development and other outcomes.
Yeah. Thanks, Jean. Another question in the chat, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but LNGA says, when you mentioned that good intentions alone are not enough, it made me reflect on my own situation. I'm building a mentoring and education center in the Gambia using my personal resources because I genuinely want to help young people. As a first-time founder, I sometimes worry that I may fall into the category of someone with strong intentions but limited experience. What steps would you recommend to ensure that good intentions are translated into meaningful and sustainable? And I think the word action is missing. Yeah. Any thoughts?
Well, I love that question. So I'm just going to pop in and, you know, really show gratitude for that question, because that is kind of the history of a lot of mentoring programs, is people that get excited about the idea. Maybe they were really influenced by a mentor and they feel like they want to give that to someone else, but without the toolkit for making it evidence-based. And it is true that, you know, we have this thing called, you know, like a filter, basically, where we only filter in things that kind of align with our idea that all mentoring works, that mentoring is a universally positive thing, and we kind of filter out any questions or doubts about that. You know, and so it's called confirmation bias. And what we need to do is lift that confirmation bias and be radically curious about what actually works. And there are a lot of resources. There's the book that Laura wrote. There's the book that Lisa wrote. There's wonderful resources out there. There's a book I wrote called Older and Wiser, where we really get into what works, what doesn't work. There's also something on the National Mentoring Resource Center. There's a section of it that goes through, like, how should you set up group mentoring? How should you think about cultural humility? And so there's a lot out there. There's also something, and this is kind of a pitch, but I have something called the Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring, and it's been around for almost 15 years. And it's a library of resources on what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great resource. I know one that I turn to often. Well, you know, I'd love to just pose this question to our participants, or to our attendees today, because as we move forward with more of our wisdom from our panelists, I'd love to hear from what our audience is experiencing. So if you could share with us, what is an organizational barrier that you have seen get in the way of mentoring success? And I guess the other question is, where does mentoring most often get stuck in your organizational context? Mentoring is siloed from other development opportunities. Thank you, Jameson. Wanting to push. Oh, it's happening so quickly. Hold on. 1 second, please. Fractured efforts, lots of individual efforts, but not a cohesive plan. No dedicated resources. What we run into is that everyone needs a mentor, but no one is taking responsibility for us to teach what mentoring is, and therefore there's no ownership. Time, it's always pushed as the first to go. Jeremy says asking for evidence, but not accepting qualitative data as enough.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear the reactions or the comments, or could I be so hopeful as to say the antidotes from our panelists to those comments? Jean, you want to start?
I'll let Laura start. I think it's more in her wheelhouse.
Excellent.
Well, you know, it's always interesting to me that we, especially in universities, have institutes for teaching effectiveness, but not mentoring and coaching effectiveness.
Yes.
And I put those together. And so I think mentoring is still developing as a field. I've seen a lot of changes even over the last 10 years. And especially in higher ed, I think the more that we can begin to professionalize that and have it be part of things like it's part of teaching effectiveness and faculty development is also mentoring, and mentoring of faculty to other faculty as well. So kind of having a place that lives helps gives it that structure, resources. I think Wake Forest has done a nice job. They have a mentoring center that doesn't oversee any of the mentoring, but they provide resources. Nora's done something similar at the University of New Mexico. And so kind of thinking about what that looks like in an institution. In organizations, it's harder if they're smaller organizations because you just don't have the bench depth to be able to do that. Often it's going to come out of HR, but there's increasing training and development and other areas around mentoring. And so even at I'm in a 40,000 and growing healthcare organization, and we're talking a lot about coaching. They don't know a lot about mentoring. There's some passionate supporters. And I'm kind of saying, look, if this is something that we want to have as organizational strategy, then let's stand up like the Cleveland Hospital did, a center for coaching and mentoring excellence, because then you have a very visible place to go. If it's smaller, then kind of finding communities like this is really important, whether you're in HR or faculty, whatever, side you're on, there are some resources, because having that coordinated effort helps people just have more time to do it well, because they're, mentoring's like most relationships. If you don't have a lot of the structure that we've talked about here in education, it might work, it might not. It kind of just depends on the parties. And that we put a lot of investment for that to be the outcome. And we do know quality relationship matters, and people, these are skills that people can learn. So really finding a home and getting more than yourself, because you need several advocates. I have seen people really move the needle by doing that.
Yeah. There's a few comments too about one of the barriers being negative, no accountability for negative mentoring. Any thoughts on what do you do when you have volunteer mentors and you want to encourage you want to encourage all efforts in mentoring and yet create some accountability for when the mentoring is counterproductive?
Yeah, I'll just try to take that one.
Sure.
I think part of it, the reason it's hard to capture these things, and I actually took a year off from being a professor and worked at a mentoring program in match support just to kind of see the inside. And what was so hard is that it's hard to have accountability when there's no data, right? So much of mentoring happens in conversation, in texts, and and relationships can look like they're thriving when in fact they're not. And so I think what we need are systems, and this is where I'm trying to leverage technology to help with this, that captures some of the granularity. And I think we also have to think about mentoring as a two-way street, much more than we do, that there needs to be professional development opportunities for mentors, credentialing, micro-credentialing, institutes, and things that things that they can list on LinkedIn, but things that, really promote the reciprocal benefits of mentoring.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, Jean, and one that we hadn't yet touched on, which is, it is the reciprocal nature of mentoring is one of the things that makes it so unique and makes it such a triple win for whatever the organization is. And we don't leverage that enough in terms of continuing, in terms of providing that benefit for mentors, but also leveraging that for organizations through ongoing development, but also through the intentionality of mentors coming in with their own developmental needs in mind as well. So Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Jean, I want to talk about technology a little bit. I know you're doing a lot of research on AI, and in fact published a paper today on that very topic. But let's talk a little bit about the importance of technology and AI in successful mentoring initiatives. Can you talk a little bit about what role you see technology and AI playing in helping organizations translate mentoring research into day-to-day policies and practices?
Yes, I think that it can. My whole idea for how we bring in AI and technology to mentoring is the notion of human at the helm, that we always keep the mentor front and center with the mentee. And too often we see this on college campuses. We're trying to replace the advising, the mentoring relationship with chatbots that sound very conversational and are sycophantic and problematic, when in fact, and so then people want to throw it out and they hate AI, but there actually are some wonderful uses for technology. And I would say one of them is this transparency issue. So I created a platform called Mentor Pro with the idea that what if we took everything we knew about what mentoring works, which is there has to be good training, there has to be oversight of those relationships, there has to be regular kind of check-ins so that the engagement remains the same. Engagement is key to mentoring. You have to have the dosage. You can't just have the relationship and no dosage. And so trying to use technology as a platform to enable that engaged, well-trained, well-supervised relationship. Where AI fits in is something called cognitive load. And that is, we all know this, anybody who's ever advised students, right before a meeting with them, or to keep the threads of many conversations going, you have to familiarize and refamiliarize yourself with this person. So what if AI was a back office tool to reduce that cognitive load so that you could actually be more present? What if it kind of, like, if you're working, in my case, in a campus advising system, I'm a professor and I have 90 advisees, and what if, like, right before my meeting with any one of them, it pulled data from Canvas and data from all the different sources so that I had a quick snapshot, as well as a synthesis of our previous conversations, any notes I've taken. So that's where I see it coming in, is less as a substitute for human connection, but more as a way to scale and improve human connection. And one final way that AI could help is, and Ben, you mentioned well-being as a key factor, no matter where you're working. And there's this growing line of what's called single session interventions. If you don't know about them, you should, where researchers are finding that if you can just capture the active ingredient of a maybe long-term treatment, whether it's for anxiety, depression, stress management, whatever it is, that we're capturing the active ingredient and creating trainings that are only 20 to 30 minutes. So what if AI could surface really good trainings or really good resources like Laura's book or other things, so that it was right at the fingertips of the mentor, but never replacing the mentor?
Mm, I love that.
And
I love
I
that.
would love to add to that because I think what Jean's saying is spot on. And I even just tested it out the other day to help a program manager. So you do have to have good prompts, like know what you're trying to do. But I kind of gave it all the information, and man, it made a theory of change like that. And it wasn't perfect. I had to tweak a little thing, but it really gave a one-page document then a program manager can use to talk with their stakeholders to help build. So I hope program managers also think about it, as she kind of referenced towards the end, like what are some tools they can use to help provide information?
Yeah. One of the things that I'm seeing is that it can be used as a great self-reflection tool, right? So, here are the things that I'm thinking about. How should I prepare for my next session with my mentor? Or my mentee has been struggling with blah, 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 blah. What are some questions that I can ask them so that I don't get into fix mode?
Yes.
Before. So it's great preparatory tool as well, instead of supplanting it. Ben, any thoughts?
Well, I would like to add to your last comment, because in our last book that we edited with Keith Walker, there's a chapter that looks at mentoring through reflective questions, and whether you do it through, you ask yourself, what are some of the approaches that you would like to take, or some of the strategies with mentoring this person, or where have you been struggling yourself? That chapter really helped me, or written by Kabini Sangha and Keith Walker, asking those reflective questions. And whether you use AI, at the core of it, it's still the human component, whether you're self-reflecting or reflecting on how you can support others. One thing that I've seen in my work with teacher candidates, so pre-service teachers before they get into the program, they're all AI trained, much more than I am. And what we've seen in one of the last activities, where I asked them to put together a brochure of some sorts, and it was the human component and the number of reiterations that they had to approach different AI tools, but it all came down to the number of different, asking prompts, clarifying prompts, and making sure that the prompts are clear for the AI. And then at the end of the day, it was the human component that really mattered. AI provided the tools and the supports, but without the human input, it was not helpful for whatever goals they set for that activity. So something for us to consider in mentoring as well, the human touch. And I think Jeremy highlighted, Jean, your article on a human at the helm, which is still key, no matter what kind of tools we have.
There was a question that Sarah asked early on, and I was tabling it, Sarah, because I wanted to make sure that we had adequate space for it, which is, how about creating a mentoring culture beyond the program itself? What can organizations be doing beyond the program, beyond program management, beyond accountability for mentors and mentees to create a mentoring culture?
If I may just jump in, one
Please.
of the, as I was reflecting on a question about the barriers before, and one of the barriers that I've seen for policy, for effective mentoring policies, is other organizational policies that actually prevent mentoring from happening. So, for example, one of the things that we've started in our faculty, we started a new faculty mentoring program. And it was very successful for many years. And then suddenly, for the last 5 years, the program died. And any guesses why it died? Because we didn't have any new hires. We had a hiring freeze, and the university prevented us from having a mentoring program. So now we have the need for the mentoring. Well, we didn't have the need for mentoring program, but we have the need for mentoring supports, and we continue that informally. So something that I think would be helpful for building the culture of mentoring is having supportive policies, and not necessarily that are directly related to mentoring, but a lot of indirectly related, policies that are indirectly related to mentoring, like hiring policies or workload policies, workload reduction, and all of that. I think having those will increase the culture of mentoring overall.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just add to that, in academics, I've been on countless promotion tenure committees, and we don't really take mentoring seriously enough. We look, oh, okay, what have they done administratively, service? That's one category. What have they done teaching? And most importantly, how many things have they published and so forth? If mentoring was the fourth leg of that stool, we would have a different culture in our universities.
Yeah. I'll just add, in my own experience with organizations, that what I like to tell them is a mentoring culture is a learning culture. And how is your organization celebrating and promoting learning as a value, right? So, the best success story that I can recall in my own client experience is an organization where the CEO asked everybody who reported to her, and in turn, they asked each of their direct reports and held them accountable from a review standpoint to show how they were investing in their own learning and in the learning of somebody else in the past performance period. It didn't have to be mentoring. Mentoring could be one way of it. But if you're celebrating and promoting and holding people accountable for learning, you're much more likely to be promoting a mentoring culture. Because while we on this call tend to be invested in formal mentoring programs, the informal mentoring, the cultivation of developmental relationships. I know my colleague and friend Kathy Cram is on this call, and this has been a key part of her scholarship as well, of creating those relationships as well is really part of kind of the proliferation of a mentoring culture as well. So other thoughts from others?
Well, I appreciate that, Lisa, because especially where I am, I see that there's lots of what I would call micro mentoring embedded in things. So one of our big safety behaviors, the very first one, is practice with a questioning attitude, which is exactly the kind of curiosity that we want people to have as mentoring. And then we have a lot of performance coaching, again, that we're really trying to roll out to teach people how to ask questions around learning. What else do you need to be supported? And so I agree that we can informally look for the behaviors that kind of promote those kinds of conversations that provide those mentoring moments.
Mhm.
I agree. I'd like to add that I think in some ways, AI is going to make it so that we have more mentoring moments. And I know that sounds antithetical, but here's the idea, is that when universities in particular become less about just conveying information and grading tests and papers that we don't even know whether AI did it or the student did it, we're going to have to pivot more toward apprenticeship style learning. Let the AI do its thing. But the only way that professors and others are going to be able to vouch for students in the future is by having shared experience, experiential learning where they're side by side in a lab, in a service activity, in something, and actually observing these students and their character in real time. And so I think that if we can do some of that cognitive load shifting of some of the traditional ways we've handled education and learning, we can free up more time for experiential learning, which will enable professors and others to vouch for students more freely.
And Lisa, if I
Mhm.
may add to what was shared already, I think what we've seen both at the higher education and the school level is if people in organizations see the value of mentoring, not just an add-on. Contrived mentoring. I do mentoring because I have to as part of my job. When it's natural and it becomes the value added component, then people will be more, we talked about buy-in. A lot of people talked about the importance of buy-in. Then we'll have more successful in mentoring programs. In schools we see, if it's a contrived mentoring, I am mentoring and I'm being mentored because I have to, a part of my certification. A lot of teachers or faculty then still experience isolation. There's still attrition, there's still, uneven guidance. But if it becomes more of an embedded value added piece, then it can create the culture of mentoring where people want to engage. They strive to learn from others and share their knowledge with others. I think that would be key for a lot of our institutions.
That's great. We do have some time for questions. So if you do have a question, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, we'll call on you. And while you're thinking of your question, there is one that I get often, and I would love to just pose to our panelists, and then Etta will get to yours as well, which is, what is one metric? We talked about the importance of looking at measurement, but if you were to pick one metric that you think is the most important indicator that mentoring is working within the organization, and that might be an impossible question. So if you've got to make it two, we'll allow that as well. But what would you say? Laura, you want to start?
Yes, thank you for giving me two, because I was like, I can't do one. I think the first would be relationship quality, and there are ways to measure that. And I've done research too that shows that the more the relationship quality is high, the more likely you are going to have those benefits. And by quality, I don't mean we're nice to each other. It's they're connecting them to new ideas. They have some of that emotional resilience Dean talked about. I can share things about myself that might make me not look as competent in your eyes.
Mhm.
So I think measuring that, and then some way of measuring whatever the goal is, whether that's I'm on track, behind, ahead of what my goals were for mentoring. It can be a very simple measure, or whether if it's retention, then you're looking at retention data. So some outcome measure that's getting you some proxy for what one of the main goals was for the organization would be my two.
Thank you. Ben?
I think it depends on the context, and I think contextual alignment is key. So, for example, when we talk about the graduate student mentoring, what would be one of the goals? Maybe becoming a tenure track faculty member. So that could be, not necessarily tangible, but something that goal that can help. When we're talking about teacher induction and mentoring, I think one of the key metrics would be retention. How many new teachers are we keeping, and what role does that mentoring program or informal mentoring play out? I do a lot of research across US and Canada, and in some areas, especially in the US, the attrition rate is more than 50%. So if you think of all the resources that are being put into the new workforce, and then half of that workforce leaves within the first 5 years, that creates a lot of other issues for the organizations. We have lower attrition rates in Canada, but still very high. Some areas between 25 to 35%, which is fairly high. And so that could be a metric in the mentoring program for teachers. So I think context is key, and knowing what kind of contextual aspects you're working with would allow you to determine what measurements you want to build in.
Yeah, I love that. Jean, any additional thoughts on the metrics?
Yes, I would add engagement, because that's the research we're finding that across all of the outcomes, if you don't have engagement, you don't have the outcome. And the dependent variable, as Ben said, depends entirely on what your goals are. And there's good measures for all of these things. We shouldn't be creating homegrown instruments where possible. But in our work on MentorPro, we're finding that the number of check-ins, the number of conversations, the number of goal setting, all of those kind of indicators of engagement. We then look at grades and credits earned and things like that that are hard outcomes, and we find a strong relationship. So if you can't measure those institutional variables, you can just measure engagement, and you're going to have a pretty good proxy indicator.
Excellent. Thank you. Edda.
Yeah, thank you. This is very, very, very good conversation. I'm really grateful for the scholars that are here and all the research that you do. I think part of a lot of your research was what was the basis for a very successful faculty research mentoring program I helped design and ran for almost 10 years. That was an incentivized program. So this question is kind of a two-parter kind of. It kind of gets to the measurements as well. I put the question in the chat earlier about, for those incentivized programs, what measures are you using to show them return on investment? Because I promise you that line kept shifting depending on whatever leadership I sent it to say this is why it's so important. And I always use the most conservative numbers. And for us, it was how many research dollars were coming in the door, because that's why they were put into these mentoring relationships. So if someone could speak to, are there standard, won't say standard, what types of measures are you using to get to the return on investment if you have incentivized programs? And then my other question has to do with the culture in general. For me, I was a staff administrator, assistant vice chancellor at IU in Indianapolis. I was on the staff council for years. And the one thing that always got talked about was how much staff were mentoring our students, and nobody knew it. We had janitors mentoring students, and nobody knew it. These students needed some conversations with safe people. And you don't get that oftentimes in a faculty student mentoring relationship. So how are we being inclusive in our mentor program designs to make sure that it's really bringing in an inclusive structure? So sorry for the long question, but there we go.
Great questions. Great questions. Who'd like to take that?
Well, I don't know that I have a perfect answer, but I would say that often programs are set up and then the context change, strategy changes. And I think one thing we need to be mindful of is, well, when that changes, does our mentoring program need to change? Like what Ben talked about, we no longer have new faculty, so we probably don't need a new faculty mentoring program. I don't think we do that enough as part of just sort of a whatever annual, semi-annual kind of check-in. But ROI, there's people always go to the money, and that's important. But there's also some things to think about in terms of just what would it cost to replace someone, or the developmental benefits. And we just had that conversation recently at my organization. So kind of thinking creatively, like, yes, there is a monetarily return and we can put some dollars to that, but there's more than that in terms of sort of well-being. There's a lot of research. The more happier people are at work, the better job they do, the more creative they are, the less stressed they are. So I think kind of tying it to some of those things, I would encourage, thinking outside of just the monetarily ROI, which is what people go to.
Thank you for that. I just want to make a point that in our staff faculty mentoring program, our first 5-year review showed that well-being was the highest outcome for the mentee. And again, how do you articulate that as something that's important for that institution, that that faculty feels a sense of well-being? They're going to stay. We
Look
kind of
at Barbara
tired.
Fredrickson's work. If you need some evidence, she has some great
Yeah.
stuff out of UNC.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. And there's so much more we could really say, Etta, in response to your questions and comments as well. So to the extent that there are comments from the attendees, please put those again in the chat. There's never enough time to talk about these subjects we all feel so passionate about. And I know Amy had a great question that I'll pose as we close as well, which is how often do you need to be revisiting to make changes? Before our panelists answer that, just because I know some folks have to drop at the top of the hour, note that you'll be receiving a brief survey tomorrow by email. We'd ask that you just take a few minutes to reflect and share your thoughts. And Michelle has put our future MELD seminar webinars, and the next one being on July 8th, about integrating mentoring with leadership development. So we hope you will join us there as well. So with that, any comments to Amy's lingering question about how often to revisit to make changes so that you're not constantly adjusting, but you are adjusting as needed?
I hate to overspeak, but I would say think of it formative during the program. You should be collecting some data to make some adjustments if there's some issues, and then summative at the end. So whenever your program ends, and sometimes people have very brief kind of mentoring programs, you might need to think about your organizational cadence. But that would be a time to look at that data and think, what do we need to change for the next iteration?
Beautiful. Well, I just want to thank Ben, Laura, and Jean for your time, the really inspiring, thought-provoking, and informative wisdom that you shared with us today about how to really create cultures of mentoring and sustainable mentoring initiatives within organizational context. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to everybody who attended. Don't forget to save that chat and to download it. And we'll look forward to seeing you in July for our next MELD webinar. Thank you all so much for joining.